Does that song remind you of anything? Does it remind you of your life sometimes? It reminded me of a trip that I took with my wife and kids. A number of years ago, we decided to plan a trip to Orlando, to Disney World, the happiest place on earth, right? And we got the kids together and we decided, hey, let's invite Grandma and Grandpa. Let's invite my parents to come along with us. And so the 7 of us got ready for this trip. And there's a line in that song, I think, that really typifies what this trip, or at least the beginning of this trip, was like. It says, alarm clock ringing, my bare feet hit the floor. It's off to the races, everybody out the door. Feeling like I'm falling behind. It's a crazy life. And that's what that trip started off like. We were living in Calgary at the time, and so to get to the airport on time for our flight, which was an international flight, we had to get up at like 3 a.m. for a flight. Anybody have to ever get up for a flight at 3 a.m.? That is cruel and unusual punishment, isn't it? And we got up at 3 a.m. and we are racing out the door because we got to leave the car in the long-term parking, which means we had to take a shuttle over to the terminal, and everything is just running behind, and we're just, come on, let's go. We get to the Calgary airport where there's customs, right? And wouldn't you know, everybody else in the world decided to go south for the winter as well at that time. And so we're like, oh, are we going to make our flight? It was just, oh, my goodness, are we going to do this? And we got through customs and to our gate, and finally we could breathe for a moment. And we get on the plane, and I'm watching the clock as our departure time ticks by, and the plane is still sitting on the tarmac. And this wouldn't be a big deal because we're on vacation, right? Everything is just easy breezing when you're on vacation, right? Except we had a layover in Minneapolis. And as that flight sat on the tarmac in Calgary, that window that we had to make our flight in Minneapolis got smaller and smaller and smaller. And finally, that plane took off. We landed in Minneapolis. And wouldn't you know it, our gate that we arrived on was exactly the opposite end of the airport from where our gate was that we were getting on the plane to go to Orlando. So here we are, the 7 of us. And this was back, Liam was like 8 years old at the time. My oldest was 16, and Emma was like 7 or 6. And we're dragging them through the airport. Come on, run fast as their little legs could handle. And my parents, come on, Mom and Dad, we got to catch this plane, right? And I remember looking back at one point as we're running by everything, trying to get to our gate, and I saw one of our party, and I won't tell you who it was, but they were on one of those moving sidewalks. If you've been to Minneapolis, you know they have moving sidewalks. And when I get on one of those, I'm using that to exponentially increase my speed, right? So that I come off it, that I'm almost at a run. But I look back, and there's this one person, again, I won't tell you who it is because they might be watching online, and they are standing on the moving sidewalk, enjoying all the sights that Minneapolis has to offer. Come on, we got a gate to get to, and we go running there, and we get to the gate, and we get onto the plane, and we could breathe. And I'll tell you, we were going to the happiest place on earth, but it was not the happiest moment of our vacation. And it's because we were missing something. We were missing something pretty important, something called margin. Have you ever experienced something like that? Have you ever found that you just are running, and it's a crazy life, and you don't even have time to breathe? And suddenly there's tension in relationships. There's tension inside of you because you're missing something. You're missing margin. And all of us have this desire inside of us. We want to have the very best life, don't we? We want to have a full life. There's lots of things we could do, and we don't want to miss out on anything. We have this thing called FOMO. Have you heard of this thing? FOMO, fear of missing out. Does anybody have that? This fear of missing out. We want a full life. We want the best life. We want the experiences that everybody else around us has. And yet in the midst of getting that fullness of life, we find ourselves having trouble breathing, and that song that we just heard expresses often how we feel. That driving beat, right? Did anybody feel stressed when you heard that? When I heard that for the first time, I was driving my car, and I'm like, I don't like this song at all. And then it comes to that moment where it's breathe, right? And it feels so good, and that's what margin is all about. And today we're starting this new series called Margin. And for the next 4 weeks, we're going to talk about what margin is, why margin is so important, how can we find margin in an already hectic life, and how we can live every day within the margins the way Christ intended us to live. And today we want to talk about what is margin. What is this thing that we need so much that when we hear a song like that, which is driving us towards this moment of breathing, that it just makes such an impact on us when there's space in our day. You see, margin is this incredible thing. It's a gift that God gives us. It's a gift that makes it possible for us to thrive in our life, not just survive. You know, that trip that I told you about, we survived Minneapolis Airport. But if we had had some margin in our life, it would have been a totally different story, and we would have thrived in Minneapolis. And margin is this space that enables us to thrive in life, not just survive. And today I want to tell you 3 stories about 3 groups of people who were living without margin. And from their stories, we can learn what margin is so that we can look at our lives and assess, are we living within the margins or are we living outside the margins? Are we thriving or are we just surviving? If you have your Bibles, turn with me to the book of Exodus. We're going to look at Exodus 18. Exodus is close to the front of the Bible. And if you don't have a Bible, we have these brown ones at the back. We would love it if you would take this home with you and keep it as a gift from us, because we believe that this has everything that we need in order to live the way God intends for us to live, including around margin. And we're going to look at Exodus 18. Exodus 18 is this part of the story of a guy by the name of Moses. And Moses was a great leader, one of the very best that Israel ever had. And God had entrusted Moses to lead his people, the Israelites, out of slavery in Egypt. And he had entrusted Moses to create a people group, a nation called Israel. And Moses was uniquely equipped to do this. And Moses had led the people out, and he had had unprecedented success. Incredible things had happened. And one day, as he's leading, Moses' father-in-law comes to visit, a guy by the name of Jethro. And Moses' father-in-law comes to visit, and Moses, for some reason, decides, hey, it's take your father-in-law to work day. And so he does. And if you're a son-in-law, you know why he's doing this, okay? Daughter-in-laws probably know this too. But every son-in-law knows that they are looking for something from their father-in-law. They are looking for some specific words to be said. And Moses was looking for Jethro to say these words. He was looking for Jethro to say, wow, I'm so proud of you. I'm so glad that you married my daughter. Every son-in-law wants to hear that. Unfortunately, that's not what Moses hears when he takes his father-in-law to work. Follow along beginning at verse 14 in chapter 18. It says, when Moses, his father-in-law, saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he asked, what are you really accomplishing here? That doesn't sound good, does it? Why are you trying to do all this alone while everyone stands around you from morning till evening? Now, I think Moses probably thought, my father-in-law is not getting it. He doesn't understand what it is that I'm doing here, because my father-in-law is just a shepherd, and he's a priest. He really doesn't know what's going on. And so Moses starts to explain. He says this, because the people come to me to get a ruling from God. When a dispute arises, they come to me, and I'm the one who settles the case between the quarreling parties. I inform the people of God's decrees and give them his instructions. I'm leading the way God has entrusted me to lead. That's what Moses' response is. And Moses was uniquely equipped to do this job. He had been raised in the courts of Pharaoh. He had watched Pharaoh rule over millions of people, do exactly what Moses is doing. And so Moses is copying this. And he explains this to his father-in-law, and his father-in-law responds. Guess what he says? This is not good. You don't want to hear that from your father-in-law, right? This is not good, Moses' father-in-law exclaimed. You're going to wear yourself out, and the people too. This job is too heavy a burden for you to handle all by yourself. Now listen to me, and let me give you a word of advice. Those are words we don't want to hear from a father-in-law either, right? Just not the best thing. Jethro says, this is not good. It's not that he's disappointed with Moses. That's not what's going on here. Is Jethro saw everything that Moses was doing, and he's worried about Moses. You see, Moses is leading, but he's leading at his limits. He is spending every moment from morning until evening, every day of the week except for one, the Sabbath. And he is listening to the people, and he is ruling, and he is leading. And there is no margin in his life because he is leading at his limits. And Jethro sees what his son-in-law is doing, and he says, you are going to wear yourself out because you are at your limits every single day. And you're going to wear the people out. They're going to start grumbling as well because you don't have any margin in your life. Think of it like this. My friend recently got a big trailer, a camper trailer, and he parked it in his driveway. And I came home and I saw this big trailer that barely fits in his driveway. And I said to my wife, I wonder what they're towing that with. Because my friend owns SUVs, small SUVs, like we do, actually even smaller than our SUV. And I thought, how can he be towing that SUV, that trailer, with his SUV? And one day we were out on the driveway and we were talking together, and I said, so what are you towing this thing with? Because your SUV can't do that. And he pointed over and he said, I'm towing it with that SUV. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is not going to turn out well. You see, every vehicle has a towing capacity. That's the maximum amount of weight that it can tow. And my friend had gone out and he had researched what SUV would be perfect to pull this trailer. But he didn't want a really big SUV, he wanted a small SUV. And so he took the weight of the trailer and he said, I will buy a car that is just a little bit better than the weight of the trailer. And so there is a small margin, but not very much. And he said, I have to be careful how much I put in it because the margin is so small. And I don't want to tow it at its limit. Because here's what will happen. If he overloads that trailer or overloads the car will work harder than it does usually. And what will happen is the car will start to overheat. The transmission will overheat. The engine will overheat. And over time, as an extended running at its limits, that car will break down. And his beautiful SUV will no longer be able to do it. And we are just like that. All of us have limits and loads. All of us have a limit. This is the ability, the capability that we have, and we are highly capable people. There are lots of things. We have a high limit to do whatever we need to do, but we also carry a load. And the problem comes is when our load matches our limit, because we are not built to run at our limits for extended periods of time. And what will happen is if we run at our limits for an extended period of time, we will burn ourselves out. And we will no longer be able to run at that limit. Because once you burn yourself out, the limit is reduced significantly. And margin is the space between our limit and our load. Margin is the space between our limit and our load. And we need to have that in our life. Sure, there are times when we have to run at our limit. But the majority of time we need to spend having margin between our limit and our load. Because what happens is we'll sideline ourselves if we run at our limit. Running at my limit was my 30s. Okay? When Britton and I hit our 30s, it seemed like life went into overdrive. This is when 2 of our 3 kids were born. Okay? And they were born a year and a week apart. We had twins the hard way. Not sure if there's an easy way, but we did it the hard way. And if you have 2 kids under the age of 2, that just means you need 2 of everything, right? 2 high chairs, 2 cribs, 2 car seats. It means you need a bigger car, too, when you have a nice little fun little Jeepish kind of car that we had, and it fit a family of 3 great, and now you're 5 within a year, and it's like, okay, I guess we're getting a sedan, right? And everything got more expensive. And at the same time, my career started to go crazy as well. I'm a new dad trying to figure out how to be a dad to 3 kids, not just 1. And then my career takes off. And my work decides that they're going to move from Regina to Calgary. And they want me to go with them. And they promote me in there. And then they promote me again. And then they have a fire a month before I'm supposed to leave to go to Calgary in the campus in Regina. And I have to figure out how do we continue to provide services on the campus in Regina as well as the campus in Calgary. And that was only the first 2 years of my 30s. They opened another campus in Toronto. I started traveling all over the place. And life just got hectic and more hectic and more hectic. Everything just kept piling on top of each other. That bar graph that was there, my limit was reached. And for 10 years, I ran as hard as I could at the very top of my limit until in 2009, in fall of 2009, almost 10 years after Liam was born, I hit a wall and I had to sit out for 3 months because I'd run for too long at my limit and I needed to learn something about margin. Margin is the space between your limit and your load. Moses had to learn that. Moses, who had an incredible limit, had to learn that he could run at that limit, that he had to entrust other people to help him with the work that he'd been entrusted to. Let me go to the second story, and let's round out this definition of what margin is. We're going to go to the book of Acts, to Acts chapter 6. And Acts chapter 6 is the story of the first church. And actually, the leaders of the first church were in a situation a lot like what Moses was in. They're leading a church of tens of thousands of people. And this is a vibrant church. They live kind of like a family. They live in such a way that those who had more shared with those who had less. And all of the disenfranchised people in Jerusalem had their needs met, as particularly widows and orphans. The problem is that these leaders, these apostles, were living and leading just like Moses did. And there began to come disputes and fights amongst the people in the church because some people weren't getting ministered to. They weren't getting fed in the feeding program that was being given to the widows and the orphans. They were missing people. And so there was arguments that started to develop. And so the apostles, they stepped back for a moment. They looked at what was going on and they made a decision. And here's what it says, verse 2 in Acts chapter 6. So the 12 called a meeting of all the believers, and they said, "We apostles should spend our time teaching the word of God, not running a food program. And so, brothers, select 7 men who are well respected and full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will give them this responsibility. We apostles can spend our time in prayer and teaching the word." The disciples were overwhelmed. Their limit was reached, and they were running at it, and people, just as Jethro talked about, remember in Exodus, he says you're going to wear yourself out and the people out. Well, guess what? The disciples were wearing themselves out and the people out. And so they took a step back. And sometimes we need to do that. When we discover we don't have margin in our life, we need to step back and take a look at what's going on around us. And the disciples asked an amazing question, a question that we have to ask as well. What should we be doing? What should you be doing? You see, in life, there are lots of things we could do. I mean, at this time, in this century, at this moment, there is countless number of things like never before that we could occupy ourselves with. There's all these things that we could do. We can fill our schedule up with work. We could fill our schedule up with ESPN. We could fill our work up with all sorts of leisure activities. All these things that we could do, education galore. But the question we need to ask is, what should we do? And margin is the space between what you could do and what you should do. And the challenge is that we don't often ask this question. And we just fill things up again, more and more and more. I never asked this question in my 30s. And I ended up with great responsibility, but at the same time, I was responsible for things I really didn't care about or want to manage. Margin is the space between what you could do and you should do. Have you ever asked that question? Of all the things that we are doing in our calendar, of all the things that we are doing with our finances, what are the things that we should do? Ephesians 2:10. We studied this verse a few months ago when we went through the book of Ephesians. Ephesians 2:10, it says, "For you are God's masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus to do good things which he planned long ago." And what that means is there are things that you should be doing. That there are things in this world that you have been uniquely created to do. And there are other things in this world that are just as good. But there is this one thing, or many things, that God has said that you need to be doing. And we need to ask the question, what should I be doing in the midst of all the things that I could do? Jim Collins, an author and a business speaker, has this great axiom that I love to repeat to myself when I ask this question. It's this: the enemy of the great is the good. And we have to decide amongst all the good things in the world, all the things that we could do, what are the great things that God is calling us to do? Like going to Rwanda. What are the great things? For me, in my 30s, when I hit that wall, I had to stop and I had to ask that question. Of all the things that I've been doing over the last 10 years, what are the things that God has uniquely equipped me to do that nobody else can do? And I remember sitting down with my boss, who was also my mentor at the time, and saying to him, you know what? I hear God saying I need to be doing this. And if I can't do that here, then I'll need to leave. Because I'd heard what God wanted me to do out of all the things that I could be doing. And actually, that's part of what led me to be here with you at Living Hope, was asking the question of all the things I could do, what should I do? Have you ever asked that question? Of all the things that you're doing, should you be doing those things? This is the beginning of finding out what margin is all about. You know, the apostles, they asked this question, what should we do? And they said, you know what? Running a food program is good. But God has equipped us and gifted us something to do something else. They were uniquely equipped to feed the tens of thousands of people. Do you know how I know that? Because they assisted Jesus when he fed 5,000 men and women and children. So if anybody's suited to run a food program, it's these guys, because they'd done it with Jesus. And yet they say, you know what? There's something else that God is calling us to do. So there's going to be 7 other people that we're going to turn this over to. And you know what happens? This is the great part of the story. Everybody thrives. The church at that point had been stalled for a little bit of time. But all of a sudden, the disciples release this thing that they shouldn't have been doing and grab what they should be doing, and they thrive. The 7 men, they thrive. The church explodes with new growth, and the church worldwide spreads to where we are today. Because those men found their margin. Because margin is the space between what you could do and what you should do. And margin is what enables you to thrive. There's one more story I want to tell you. It's found in the book of 1 Kings. 1 Kings 19. And this is the story of a man named Elijah. And actually, this chapter 19 is when Elijah was at his lowest point in his life. Right before this, he was at the highest point in his life. You see, in 1 Kings 18, he had challenged the prophets of a false god to a prayer battle. He'd invited them out to a place called Mount Carmel, and he said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to create an altar, and we're going to put a sacrifice on it, and then we're going to step back, and we're going to pray to our gods, you to your false god, me to Yahweh, and we're going to ask him to light it on fire. Okay, so there's 450 prophets of the false god. They get out and they start dancing around this thing and carrying on and having a great big wow just party, and nothing happens. The altar stands firm, the sacrifice on top of it, nothing happens. Elijah builds an altar as well. And he puts the sacrifice on it, and then he says, I want you to bring some water and douse this thing thoroughly with water and dig a trench around it to catch all that water so it doesn't go anywhere. And then Elijah steps back and he just quietly kneels down and he prays. And boom, God rains down fire and consumes that altar and the water. Wow. And then Elijah has the prophets rounded up and executed. And this is the high point of everything that he's done. We teach this in Sunday school to our kids, because this shows the awesome power of God when we are faithful. But here's the thing, in chapter 19, the queen gets wind of this. And she says, off with his head! And hires hitmen to go and take him out. And how do you think Elijah, this guy who just saw the mighty power of God come down from heaven, how do you think he responds? He runs away. He runs as far and as fast as he can to get away from the queen and her hitmen. In verse 3, it says this: Elijah was afraid and fled for his life, for he went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there. And then he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. And he said this: I have had enough, Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. Elijah, who just had been at this high, says, I've had enough. Just kill me. I wish I was dead. I can't take any more. You see, Elijah is emotionally spent. His emotional margin is gone. Physically, he can still run a great distance, okay? So his physical margin was there. Spiritually, he still runs to God. He still talks to God. He still has faith, so his margin was still there. Mentally, he's smart enough to say, I need to get out of Dodge because the queen is going to kill me. But emotionally, he's spent. He's got nothing left, and there's something we need to learn here. When you're emotionally spent, it doesn't matter how much margin you have in every other area of your life. When you are emotionally spent, you're done. This is how important it is to be emotionally healthy. If you aren't emotionally healthy, nothing else will be. We need margin in our life, this ability for us to recover, to react, to process what has gone on in our life. This is our emotional margin. And when we don't have that ability, we are running at our limits and we will burn ourselves out. And so Elijah runs away. He says, I've had enough. In verse 5, it says, Then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. But as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, Get up and eat. And he looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. So Elijah withdraws, and he just needs to care for himself. And I said, sometimes when we are running at our limit for an extended period of time, we just need to withdraw. We just need to step back from everything, and it depends on how long you've been running at your limits for. Maybe a short time, maybe a long time. But you need to just step back and take care of yourself physically, take care of yourself mentally, and find some emotional health so that you can figure out where the margin has been too thin in your life. It says, Then the angel of the Lord came again and touched him and said, Get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you. Now, Elijah has to step back because margin is that space where you can catch your breath. Margin is that space where you can catch your breath, where you can figure out what's next, where you can listen to God. And if you continue reading in 1 Kings 19, you'll hear that Elijah goes on to hear from God what he needs to do next. And actually, Elijah's not done like he thinks he is. God is not done with Elijah either. And the best is still yet to come. But he had to step back. He had to take a breath in order to discover what was next. Because margin is that space where you can catch your breath and find out what's next. I talked earlier about this metaphor of an engine, a car engine, right? And towing a trailer and being at its limit and wearing itself out. When you are driving your car, and you can think about this as you drive away today. When you drive your car, you will press on the accelerator, right? And you will get it up to speed. And once you're up at that speed, 50 kilometers an hour, okay, for everybody, that's normal speed, right? 40 in the school zone, don't want you to get any tickets. No texting either. When you're up to speed, what do? Do you keep pushing on that accelerator? No, you probably pull your foot off, right? And you're constantly moving between working the car to make it go faster and pulling back to make sure that it maintains the speed. And there's this rhythm of rest and work that goes on when a car is running at any given time. Now let's contrast that for a moment with a motorboat, with a boat engine. A boat engine is constantly pushing, propelling that boat forward through the water. If you let up on the accelerator, that boat comes to a stop almost instantaneously because the water is acting against that boat. And so in order to keep the boat going at a constant speed, you have to keep a constant lever or constant pressure on that accelerator so that it continues to propel that boat forward. Here's the thing. A car engine runs for hundreds of thousands of kilometers, depending on which one you buy. Don't buy Ford. No, I'm just kidding. Boo. I got booed. I haven't gotten booed since I talked about curling on stage. Anyways. Now I lost my train of thought. A car engine will last for hundreds of thousands of kilometers. A boat engine does not last as long because it doesn't have a chance to breathe. It doesn't have a rhythm of rest and work. And we were built more like car engines than we were like boat engines. We were built to have a rhythm between rest and work, a rest and work. Think of it like a pendulum going back and forth, rest and then work. The problem is that too often we do this, rest and work, and work, and work, and work, and work, and work. And we fill up our schedules with everything that we're going to do, and we don't take a moment to breathe until we're forced to. And then you know what happens? Is actually it goes to escapism, okay? Because we're tired of all that stuff that's filled our agenda, and so we pull back and we start binge watching on Netflix. Or we grab a big thing of chips and we start eating. Or we go out shopping because we're just trying to escape from all that stuff that's waiting back over there for us to get to. But if we would have a rhythm of rest and work in our lives, it would change our lives. And Elijah discovered what it meant to take a breath, to sit at God's feet and hear the whispers of his voice before all else. And this changed everything for Elijah. And he goes back the way he came. And that's what God says to him. Go back from where you came. And he goes right back to work. But he remembers to rest and to work. And the best is yet to come in Elijah's story. And margin is the space between our limit and our load. Do you have any margin there? Do you know what your limits are? Do you know what your load is? Margin is the space between what we could do and what we should do. Do you know what you should be doing? And margin is the space where you can breathe and hear what God has for you next. Do you have room to breathe in your life? This week, here's what I want to challenge you to do. In your sermon notes, on the back side of it, there are 5 areas of life and definitions to go along with it: the emotional, the physical, the spiritual, the mental, and the social. Look at those sermon notes, and I want you to ask this question: where am I thriving, and where am I just surviving? Where am I thriving and where am I surviving? And I want you to take some time and listen to what God has to say. Say, God, where am I thriving in life? And where am I just surviving? And then write that on the page. And then get together with your spouse, with a friend, or with your group. And if you don't have a group that you're part of, come on Wednesday night. We have a group that comes together every Wednesday night for adults to talk about this throughout this series. And begin to identify in your life the areas where you have margin and where you don't. And maybe this week, as things come up, as opportunities come your way, instead of just saying, yeah, we could do that, why don't you take a moment and ask God, should I do that? Is this what I should be doing? Are you thriving or are you just surviving? Margin is that space that enables you to thrive. And you know what? We just started a new year, and the theme that I heard about 2016, and I heard it again from Cam and Courtney, was that 2016 was a hard year. I heard this over and over and over again, including on TV from newscasters. Friends, what if in 2017 we thrived? What if all of us here discovered margin and began to thrive, to begin to have the life that Jesus envisions for all of us? Because Jesus came and he said, you know what, I have come that you might have life and that you might have it to the fullest. a rich and satisfying life. And you know what? You and I, we hear that and we think, oh, good, I'm just going to put more in. But what if we listened to what Jesus has to say about margin and discovered the rich and satisfying life, the fullness of life that he came for us to have? I wonder what that would look like in our lives in 2017 if all of us thrived together. You know, we don't have to wonder. It's just looking at actually Moses and Elijah and the apostles. You see, Moses discovered margin, and he went on to lead for 40 more years and become one of the greatest leaders they've ever had. Elijah went on to appoint kings, to change empires, to train his successor. And the apostles, well, they thrived, and the church thrived and catalyzed a movement that changed the world. I wonder what would happen if all of us discovered margin this month. Do you want to find out? I hope you'll come back next week.